The first fence post Caleb Thorne drove into the hard, unyielding soil of Redemption Valley felt less like an act of claiming land and more like an act of defiance. Each swing of the heavy maul sent a jarring shock up his left arm, the one that still ached from the mini-ball that had shattered his shoulder at Gettysburg. His left leg, too, was a constant, dull throb, a reminder of the canister shot that had nearly taken it, leaving him with a pronounced, permanent limp. He moved slowly, deliberately, conserving his strength, his breath rasping in the thin, dry air of the Montana Territory. The sun beat down mercilessly, reflecting off the sparse, pale grass that carpeted the valley floor, a valley that stretched wide and empty towards a horizon broken only by the distant, jagged silhouette of the Wolf Mountains. Redemption Valley. He'd chosen the name himself, hoping it might be a place where a man could find just that, a redemption from the horrors of war, a chance to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Caleb Thorne. No relation to the other Thorns we've met in these tales, for that name, like a stubborn weed, seems to sprout wherever ambition takes root. Was a man haunted by more than just physical scars? The war had taken his youth, his innocence, his two younger brothers, and left him with a deep, abiding weariness, a distrust of crowds and loud noises, and a fierce, almost desperate need for peace, for solitude, for a patch of earth he could call his own, a place where he could heal, or at least forget. He'd come west on a veteran's land grant, seeking not fortune, but sanctuary. He'd found this valley, remote, unclaimed, watered by a small, clear creek meandering down from the mountains. It was harsh country, unforgiving, but it was empty. It was quiet. And it felt right. Here, he thought, he could build his small cattle ranch, live a simple life, be left alone with his memories and his dreams. He wasn't entirely alone. He'd brought with him a handful of hardy Texas longhorns, a couple of sturdy mules, and a dog. A scruffy, intelligent border collie mix named Blue, his constant companion, whose silent loyalty was often more comforting than any human conversation. He'd also brought Sarah, his wife. Sarah Thorne was a woman forged from the same resilient pioneer stock as Caleb. She had nursed him back from the brink after his battlefield injuries, her quiet strength and unwavering devotion his anchor in the darkest days. She shared his dream of a peaceful life, her love a steady flame against the winds of hardship and memory. Their two children, 8-year-old Matthew and 6-year-old Emily, their laughter a rare, precious sound in the vast silence, were the embodiment of their hopes for the future. They had built their small cabin near the creek, a sturdy log structure chinked with mud and moss, its single stone chimney breathing a welcoming plume of smoke into the clear mountain air. They had cleared land for a garden, built corrals for the cattle, begun the back-breaking work of fencing their claim. It was a hard life, demanding relentless toil from dawn till dusk. Caleb's injuries made every task a struggle. Plowing, fencing, even saddling his horse, required a conscious effort, a grim marshalling of will against the protesting pain in his shoulder and leg. But he persisted, driven by a quiet, stubborn determination. This land, this valley, was his last stand, his only hope for a future free from the ghosts of the past. The nearest settlement to Redemption Valley was a rough-and-tumble supply town called Blackstone, a good 2 days' ride away, nestled at the mouth of the pass leading out of the mountains. Blackstone was a magnet for prospectors, trappers, buffalo hunters, cowboys, and the usual assortment of gamblers, saloon girls, and desperados that followed any scent of opportunity on the frontier. It was a place Caleb avoided whenever possible, its noise and chaos a stark contrast to the peace he sought in his valley, but it was their only source of essential supplies: flour, salt, tools, ammunition, and the place where he would eventually have to drive his cattle to market if his small herd ever prospered. The valley, for the first year, seemed to live up to its promise. The creek provided water, the grass was good, the cattle thrived. Sarah's garden produced a meager but welcome crop of vegetables. Matthew and Emily explored their new world with childish wonder, their cheeks growing rosy in the clean mountain air. Caleb, despite his constant pain, found a measure of contentment in the hard, honest labor, in the vast, silent beauty of his surroundings. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were less frequent now, the roar of cannons slowly fading, replaced by the sigh of the wind in the pines, the murmur of the creek, the distant lowing of his cattle. He was building something. He was healing, slowly. But peace on the frontier was often a fragile, fleeting thing. And Redemption Valley, it turned out, was not as unclaimed, not as unnoticed, as Caleb had hoped. His nearest neighbor, though near was a relative term in this vast country, was a man named Jedediah Stone. Again, that name, Stone, surfacing in these tales, sometimes as a brute, sometimes as a hermit, this time something else entirely. This Jedediah Stone ran a sprawling cattle operation, the Bar M, whose lands bordered Redemption Valley to the south. Stone was a different breed of cattleman than the Josiah King who plagued Redemption Creek. He wasn't overtly expansionist, not driven by the same insatiable greed. He was an old-timer, hard, taciturn, deeply suspicious of newcomers, fiercely protective of what he considered his traditional grazing rights established not by legal deeds, but by years of unchallenged use. He had watched Caleb Thorne's arrival in Redemption Valley with a wary, resentful eye. He saw the fences going up, the land being broken for crops, the precious creek water being diverted for irrigation, and he didn't like it. He saw it as an intrusion, a threat to his way of life, his access to the valley's summer pastures and vital water. Stone didn't confront Caleb directly, not at first. He sent his foreman, a surly, hard-eyed man named Riggs, with a curt message. Old Man Stone says this valley's Bar M range always has been. He don't take kindly to squatters and fence stringers. Best you move on, Thorne, before there's trouble. Caleb, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his face grim, met Riggs's hostile gaze steadily. This is deeded land, Riggs, Caleb replied, his voice quiet but firm. Filed proper with the territorial office. I ain't squatting, and I ain't moving. He knew about veterans' land grants, knew his claim was legal, even if Stone's traditional use predated it. The law in this case was on his side. But the law was a distant, abstract thing in these remote mountains. Possession, and the willingness to defend it, often counted for more. Riggs spat contemptuously. Deeds don't mean much up here, cripple, he sneered, his eyes flicking disdainfully over Caleb's lame leg and scarred shoulder. Might is what counts, and Old Man Stone, he's got the might. He wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving behind an unspoken threat that hung heavier than the summer heat. The conflict with Jedediah Stone escalated slowly, insidiously. Stone's cowboys began to accidentally drive Bar M cattle into Caleb's valley, trampling his garden, grazing down the precious grass Caleb was trying to save for his own small herd. Fences Caleb had painstakingly built were found cut, his cattle scattered. When Caleb rode out to protest, to drive Stone's cattle back, he was met by Riggs and a group of surly, heavily armed Bar M riders who offered no apology, only veiled threats and open contempt for the one-legged sodbuster. Caleb knew he couldn't win a direct confrontation. He was one man, disabled, against Stone's much larger, well-armed outfit. Sarah worried constantly, her eyes filled with a fear that mirrored Caleb's own, though he tried to hide it from her. The peace of Redemption Valley was shattering, replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a constant sense of being besieged. He began carrying his old Sharps rifle with him whenever he rode out, his Colt revolver always holstered at his hip, the familiar weight both a burden and a grim necessity. The war, he realized with a sinking heart, hadn't ended at Appomattox. It had merely followed him west, taking on a new, more personal form. He tried to reason with Stone, riding over to the Bar M headquarters once, hoping for a man-to-man discussion. Stone, a gaunt, white-bearded patriarch with eyes as cold and hard as river agates, refused to even see him, sending Riggs out again with the same dismissive message, "This is Bar M land. Get out." Caleb appealed to the law in Blackstone. The town marshal, a fat, lazy man named Henderson, a Henderson perhaps less scrupulous than the mercantile owner in Willow Creek, listened with ill-concealed boredom, then shrugged. "Range disputes? Happens all the time, Thorne. Ain't much I can do. Stone's a powerful man in this territory. Got friends? My advice? Sell out to him. Cut your losses. or learn to live with his cows. It was clear Henderson had no intention of challenging Jedediah Stone, perhaps being on Stone's payroll himself, or simply unwilling to risk the wrath of the powerful rancher. Caleb was on his own. The harassment continued, growing more blatant, more dangerous. One night, shots were fired into their cabin, splintering the logs near where Matthew and Emily slept, terrifying the children, sending a cold wave of fury and fear through Caleb and Sarah. Another time, Caleb found his small haystack, precious winter feed for his cattle, deliberately set ablaze, the flames consuming weeks of hard labor. He managed to save some of it, but the loss was devastating. Blue, his loyal collie, was found whimpering near the barn one morning, a fresh, ugly gash on his flank, likely from a kick or a whip delivered by one of Stone's riders. Caleb knew he was being pushed, systematically, ruthlessly. Stone wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was trying to break him, to drive him out through a campaign of attrition and terror. The dream of Redemption Valley, the hope for peace and healing, was turning into a nightmare. He looked at Sarah's pale, worried face, at his children's frightened eyes, and a cold despair began to settle in his heart. Maybe Stone was right. Maybe he was just a crippled sodbuster, foolishly trying to hold on to something he couldn't defend. Maybe he should give up, sell out, take his family and flee before something truly terrible happened. But then he would look at the land itself, at the valley he had come to love, at the sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, at the small graves on the distant battlefield where his brothers lay, and a different feeling would surge through him, a stubborn, unyielding refusal to be broken, to be driven off. This was his land. He had paid for it, not just with money, but with his blood, his pain, his dreams. He wouldn't surrender it to bullies and land grabbers, not without a fight. The war had taken much from him, but it hadn't taken his spirit, his courage. That he would hold on to, whatever the cost. The conflict for Redemption Valley was escalating, pitting a disabled veteran's desperate hope against an old cattleman's entrenched power, with the harsh Montana landscape as the silent, unforgiving arbiter. The relentless pressure from Jedediah Stone and his Bar M outfit began to take its toll, not just on Caleb's dwindling resources, but on the spirit of his small family. Sarah, though she tried to remain strong for Caleb and the children, grew visibly thinner, her eyes shadowed with a constant weary anxiety. The laughter of Matthew and Emily became a rare sound, replaced by hushed whispers and a fear that made them cling to their parents. The joy Caleb had briefly found in building his dream was being choked by the dust of conflict, the bitterness of injustice. He knew he couldn't sustain a long siege. His supplies were limited. Winter was approaching, and the loss of much of his haystack meant his small herd of cattle would struggle to survive the harsh Montana snows. He had to find a way to break the stalemate, to force Stone to back down, or to find allies, though in this remote valley, allies seemed as scarce as rain in a drought. He considered riding to the territorial capital, Helena, to appeal directly to the governor or federal land agents. But Helena was a week's hard ride away, a journey he couldn't easily make with his injuries, and one that would leave Sarah and the children vulnerable. And what guarantee was there that distant officials, likely influenced by powerful cattle interests, would listen to the plea of a lone, disabled homesteader against a man like Jedediah Stone? It felt like a desperate, uncertain gamble. His thoughts turned increasingly to the other few settlers in the wider region, isolated homesteaders like himself, who might also have suffered from Stone's heavy-handed tactics or feared his encroaching power. There was old Jedediah Smith, the reclusive trapper from the story of Verdant Creek, who, in this narrative, had a small cabin further up the creek from Caleb, a man who knew the mountains and Stone's ways. And there were the O'Donnells and the Garcias, families who had settled in smaller, less fertile valleys a half-day's ride away, families Caleb had met briefly during his first year. Perhaps, if they stood together, they might have a chance. United, their voices might carry more weight. United, their combined strength might make Stone think twice. Caleb decided to ride out, to seek these potential allies. He left Sarah and the children with Blue for protection, his Sharps rifle loaded, and a grim warning to stay close to the cabin and fire a signal shot if Riggs or any of Stone's men appeared. The thought of leaving them, even for a few days, gnawed at him, but he knew he had no other choice. He couldn't win this fight alone. His first visit was to old Jedediah Smith, the trapper. Smith's cabin was even more remote than Caleb's, tucked away in a narrow, pine-choked canyon. Smith himself was as weathered and gnarled as an ancient tree, his eyes holding the keen, watchful wisdom of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the secrets of the wilderness. He listened silently as Caleb laid out his plight, his frustration with Stone, his desperate need for help. When Caleb finished, Smith spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt floor. "Stone," he grunted, his voice raspy. I know Stone. Hard man, greedy. Thinks these mountains belong to him and his cows. Run off more'n one settler who got in his way." He looked at Caleb, his gaze surprisingly sharp. "But he ain't invincible, Thorne. He's got enemies too. Folks he's cheated, folks he's bullied. And he's got weaknesses." Smith paused, a shrewd glint in his eye. "Stone's biggest weakness is his pride, and his fear of the law when it can't be bought or ignored. He pushes, but he don't usually like a clean fight, not if the odds ain't heavily in his favor." Smith offered no immediate promise of help, but he gave Caleb something almost as valuable: information. He told Caleb about Stone's vulnerabilities, about past disputes where Stone had backed down when faced with united opposition or the threat of genuine legal intervention. He also mentioned a young, ambitious lawyer in Blackstone, a newcomer named Elijah Kent, who was rumored to be honest, fearless, and looking to make a name for himself by taking on powerful interests. "Might be worth talking to Kent," Smith suggested. "If you can get past Henderson, the Marshall Stone likely owns." Caleb then rode to the O'Donnell and Garcia homesteads. He found them facing similar, though less intense, pressures from Stone. Their water sources were being threatened, their grazing lands encroached upon. They listened to Caleb's proposal for a united front with a mixture of fear and hope. They were reluctant to openly defy Stone, terrified of his retribution. But the alternative, slow strangulation and eventual ruin, was equally grim. After much debate, much soul-searching, they agreed to stand with Caleb, to sign a petition detailing Stone's abuses, to travel to Blackstone with him and present their case to Marshall Henderson, and, if necessary, to the young lawyer Elijah Kent. It was a small, fragile alliance, born of shared desperation, but it was a start. Armed with this new resolve and the signed petition, Caleb, O'Donnell, and Garcia rode into Blackstone. The town was as noisy, dusty, and chaotic as Caleb remembered. They went first to Marshall Henderson's office. The marshal, as expected, was dismissive, almost openly contemptuous. He glanced at their petition, listened to their complaints with ill-concealed boredom, then reiterated his earlier advice: sell out to Stone or learn to live with him. "Stone's a pillar of this territory, gentlemen," Henderson said with a smirk. "His word carries a mite more weight than a few disgruntled sodbusters. Now, if you'll excuse me, I got real police work to attend to." He clearly had no intention of helping them. Disheartened but not defeated, they sought out the lawyer, Elijah Kent. Kent's office was a small, cluttered room above the Blackstone General Store. He was younger than Caleb expected, barely 30, with keen, intelligent eyes, a sharp jaw, and an air of restless energy. He listened intently as Caleb, O'Donnell, and Garcia laid out their grievances against Stone, spreading out their deeds, their petition, the carefully documented list of harassments and threats. Kent asked pointed, insightful questions, his legal mind quickly grasping the complexities of the situation, the nuances of frontier land law, and the pervasive influence of men like Stone. When they had finished, Kent leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil thoughtfully against his desk. "Gentlemen," he said finally, his voice firm, "you have a case, a strong one, I believe. Stone's actions are not just unethical, they are illegal. His claims of traditional grazing rights often have no legal standing against properly deeded homesteads. His methods of intimidation constitute a clear breach of the peace, at the very least." He paused. "But taking on Jedediah Stone in this territory, it will not be easy." He has money, influence, powerful friends. Marshall Henderson is almost certainly in his pocket. The courts, they can be slow, unpredictable, sometimes swayed by factors other than pure justice. "We know it's a risk, Mr. Kent," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "But we got no other choice. We lose our land, we lose everything." Kent nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "All right, Mr. Thorne. All right. I'll take your case." He named his fee, a modest one considering the risks, payable if and when they won. "We'll start by filing an official complaint with the Territorial Land Office, challenging Stone's claims, documenting his abuses. We'll petition the circuit judge for an injunction to stop Stone's harassment. It will be a fight, a long one perhaps. But," he smiled, a surprisingly confident, almost boyish grin, "I believe it's a fight worth having. And sometimes, Mr. Thorne, even in this territory, David can still beat Goliath, especially if David has the law and the truth on his side." The decision to pursue legal action, to fight Stone through the courts rather than with guns, was a significant escalation, a shift in strategy. It offered a path that relied not on violence, but on the principles of justice, however flawed and difficult to achieve on the frontier. It also brought new dangers. Stone, when he learned of their legal challenge, would undoubtedly retaliate, perhaps more fiercely than before. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, testing not just Caleb's physical endurance, but his faith in the law, his ability to inspire and lead his small band of allies, and the courage of a young lawyer daring to challenge one of the territory's most powerful men. Redemption Valley was no longer just a personal dream. It had become a symbol of a larger struggle for justice, for the rights of the small homesteader against the encroaching power of the cattle kings. The news of the legal challenge, when it reached Jedediah Stone via his informants in Blackstone, was met not with fear, but with cold, simmering rage. He had underestimated the crippled veteran, underestimated the stubbornness of these sodbusters. He had expected them to break, to flee. Instead, they had found a lawyer, a young upstart named Kent, and were daring to challenge him, Jedediah Stone, in the courts, questioning his rights, his power, his very way of life. It was an insult, an affront he would not tolerate. Stone summoned his foreman Riggs and a select group of his toughest, most loyal riders. His instructions were brief, brutal. "This lawyer, Kent," Stone growled, his eyes like chips of ice. "He needs to be discouraged, persuaded to drop this foolish case. And the settlers, Corbin, O'Donnell, Garcia, they need a harder lesson, a lesson they won't forget. Make them understand that the only law in these mountains is the law of the Bar M." He didn't explicitly order murder, not yet. But the implication was clear. Intimidation, violence, whatever it took to crush this nascent rebellion. The retaliation was swift and savage. Elijah Kent, returning late one night to his small office in Blackstone after working on the settlers' case, was ambushed in a dark alleyway. He was brutally beaten, his office ransacked, his legal papers scattered and torn. He was left unconscious, with a stark, unsigned note pinned to his coat. "Drop the case, or next time we finish the job." Kent, though badly injured, was not a man to be easily broken. When he recovered consciousness, his resolve, though shaken, was not shattered. If anything, the brutal attack solidified his determination to see justice done. He knew now, firsthand, the kind of men they were up against. The attacks on the settlers were more insidious, designed to terrorize, to isolate. The O'Donnell cabin was raided one night, their meager winter stores stolen, their livestock driven off. Miguel Garcia found his well deliberately fouled, his small irrigation ditches destroyed. And in Redemption Valley, the pressure on Caleb and Sarah intensified. Riggs and his men became a constant, menacing presence, riding past the cabin at all hours, firing shots into the air, yelling threats and obscenities. They deliberately hazed Caleb's small herd of cattle, driving them into rough country, scattering them for miles. Blue, Caleb's loyal dog, was found poisoned near the creek, his death a deliberate, cruel message. Caleb buried him with a heavy heart, the loss of his faithful companion another scar on his already wounded soul. Sarah, though terrified for her children, for Caleb, refused to break. She became Caleb's eyes and ears, her vigilance unwavering. She learned to handle the Sharps rifle, her hands surprisingly steady, her aim true. Matthew and Emily, though frightened, showed a resilience that mirrored their parents, helping with chores, maintaining a brave front, their childhood innocence irrevocably lost, but replaced by a grim, premature maturity. Caleb knew they were being pushed towards a desperate confrontation. Stone wanted to provoke him into a fight he couldn't win, to give himself an excuse to unleash the full force of his riders. But Caleb, remembering old Jedediah Smith's advice and Kent's legal strategy, refused to be baited. He documented every act of harassment, every threat, every loss, preparing evidence for the upcoming circuit court hearing. He repaired his fences, rounded up his scattered cattle, replanted his trampled garden, his quiet, stubborn resistance a daily act of defiance. He was fighting a different kind of war now, a war of attrition, of endurance, of faith in the eventual triumph of justice. But faith was hard to maintain in the face of Stone's relentless campaign. The other settlers, O'Donnell and Garcia, were wavering, their courage eroded by fear and loss. They urged Caleb to reconsider, to accept whatever terms Stone might offer, to save themselves before it was too late. Even Sarah, in her darkest moments of fear, sometimes questioned the wisdom of their continued defiance. Was this one valley, this one dream, worth risking everything, their lives, their children's future? It was during this period of intense pressure and doubt that an unexpected ally emerged, a figure from Caleb's past, a ghost from the battlefields of the war. A man named Josiah, a former sergeant in Caleb's old regiment, a freedman, strong, quiet, and deeply loyal. Josiah had been searching for Caleb for months, having heard rumors of a disabled veteran from their unit settling in the Montana Territory. He arrived in Redemption Valley one evening, a welcome, unexpected sight, his presence a sudden infusion of strength and hope. Josiah, upon hearing of Caleb's struggle against Stone, didn't hesitate. "Captain," he said, his voice firm. He still called Caleb Captain, a habit from their army days. "This ain't right. What Stone's doing, it's just bullying. Plain and simple. You fought for this country, fought for your rights. You ain't gonna let some land-grabbing cattle baron run you off your own deeded land." He unstrapped his own rifle. "Reckon you could use another hand, and another gun." Josiah's arrival was a godsend. He was a skilled frontiersman, an experienced fighter, his loyalty to Caleb unquestionable. His presence bolstered Caleb's resolve, eased Sarah's fears, and even seemed to put a temporary check on Riggs's harassment. The Bar M riders were clearly wary of this new, formidable addition to Caleb's small household. With Josiah's help, Caleb was able to better protect his property, to more effectively counter Stone's tactics. They reinforced the cabin, built defensive positions, patrolled their boundaries together. Redemption Valley, for a brief time, felt a little less besieged. But Jedediah Stone was not a man to be deterred by the arrival of one more gun. He saw Josiah's presence as an escalation, a further affront. He knew the circuit judge was due in Blackstone in a few weeks. He had to break Caleb Thorne before then, before Kent could present his case, before the law could intervene. He decided on a final, decisive stroke. He would gather his entire force, all his loyal riders, and launch an all-out attack on Caleb's ranch, overwhelm him with sheer numbers, burn him out, erase him from Redemption Valley once and for all. He would make an example of the stubborn, crippled veteran, a warning to any other sodbuster who dared defy the power of the Bar M. The emotional twist wasn't a betrayal this time, but an unexpected reinforcement, a reminder of old loyalties forged in the crucible of war, now rekindled on a new, equally desperate battlefield. Josiah's arrival didn't just bring another gun. It brought companionship, unwavering support, a shared history of courage and survival that strengthened Caleb's own resolve at a critical moment. It transformed Caleb's lonely struggle into a shared defense, a partnership against a common enemy. But it also raised the stakes, for Stone's response to this new defiance would undoubtedly be even more brutal, more desperate. The fight for Redemption Valley was about to enter its bloodiest, most decisive phase. The news of Jedediah Stone's impending attack reached Caleb not through informants or distant smoke signals, but through the intuition of old Jedediah Smith, the trapper. Smith, who moved through the mountains like a whisper, his eyes and ears attuned to every subtle shift in the wilderness, had noticed the unusual activity at the Bar M Ranch, the gathering of riders, the stockpiling of ammunition, the grim, purposeful air that signaled more than just a routine roundup. He made his way to Redemption Valley under the cover of darkness, a silent harbinger of doom. "Stone's comin', Thorne," Smith said, his voice a low rasp as he sat with Caleb and Josiah in the dim light of the cabin, Sarah and the children asleep in the small adjoining room. "Comin' hard. Figure he aims to finish this before the judge gets to Blackstone. Seen him gather every gun he's got, maybe 30-40 riders. They'll hit you at dawn, likely." The news, though not entirely unexpected, landed with the force of a physical blow. 30-40 men, against Caleb, Josiah, and possibly Sarah if it came to it. The odds were impossible. "We can't hold 'em off," Josiah said grimly, his usual quiet confidence shaken. "Not that many. Not for long." Caleb stared into the dying embers of the fire, his face etched with weariness, but his eyes held a cold, hard light. He thought of Sarah, of Matthew and Emily. He thought of the dream of Redemption Valley, the peace he had fought so hard to build. He wouldn't let Stone destroy it, not without a fight. "Maybe we can't beat 'em," Caleb said slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "But we can make 'em pay. Make 'em pay for every inch of this valley. Make 'em remember what it costs to try and take a man's home." He looked at Josiah, then at Smith. "We can't fight 'em in the open. Cabin's too exposed. But the creek, it cuts deep through that rocky bluff just east of here. Narrow passage, good cover. If we can draw 'em in there." A desperate plan began to form. They would abandon the cabin, make it look like they had fled in panic. They would lead Stone's riders into the narrow, treacherous confines of Redemption Creek Gorge, a natural bottleneck where numbers would count for less, where a few determined defenders, using the terrain to their advantage, might be able to hold off a much larger force, at least for a time. It was a long shot, a suicide mission perhaps, but it was their only chance. Sarah, when Caleb told her the plan, her face pale but her eyes steady, refused to be left behind. "This is my home too, Caleb," she insisted. "My children's future. I can shoot. I can load. I fight beside you." Matthew and Emily, awakened by the hushed, urgent voices, clung to her, their small faces filled with a terror that tore at Caleb's heart, but also a strange, premature resolve. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, they made their preparations. They loaded the mules with essential supplies, water, ammunition, what little food they had left. Sarah and the children would be hidden in a small, almost inaccessible cave high up on the gorge wall, a place old Smith knew, overlooking the planned ambush site. Caleb, Josiah, and Smith himself, despite his age, would take up defensive positions among the rocks and brush lining the narrowest part of the gorge. They would make their stand there. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks, they saw them. A dark mass of riders appearing on the southern ridge, spreading out, advancing towards the now empty cabin. Jedediah Stone himself was in the lead, flanked by his foreman Riggs, their faces grim, expectant. They reached the cabin, found it deserted. A roar of triumph went up from Stone's men. They thought Caleb had fled, broken. They began to ransack the cabin, setting fire to the outbuildings, their victory celebration premature, fueled by arrogance. Then, Caleb, from his position high in the gorge, fired a single shot from his Sharps rifle, the heavy bullet kicking up dust near Stone's horse. A clear, defiant challenge. Stone, startled, then enraged, saw the faint puff of smoke from the gorge entrance. "He's up there, in the rocks. After him, boys. Flush the coward out. No prisoners." The Bar M riders, overconfident, eager for blood, charged recklessly towards the gorge entrance, a chaotic, undisciplined mob. They rode directly into the trap. As they entered the narrowest part of the gorge, Caleb, Josiah, and Smith opened fire. Their shots, carefully aimed, devastatingly effective in the confined space, tore into the packed ranks of Stone's men. Horses screamed, reared, fell. Riders tumbled from their saddles, crying out in pain and surprise. The charge faltered, dissolved into chaos. Stone's men, caught in a murderous crossfire with no room to maneuver, no clear targets to shoot at, began to panic. Riggs, Stone's foreman, tried to rally them, cursing, yelling orders. He spurred his horse forward, firing his pistol wildly towards Caleb's position. Josiah, his aim steady, his face grim, took careful aim with his own rifle. Riggs cried out, clutching his arm, his pistol falling into the dust. He sagged in the saddle, then toppled heavily to the ground. Jedediah Stone, seeing his foreman fall, seeing his men trapped, decimated, his arrogant charge turned into a bloody rout, seemed to lose his nerve. His face, moments before contorted with rage, now went pale with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. He tried to turn his horse, to flee the deadly gorge, but it was too late. Caleb, his sharps reloaded, his aim steady despite the pain in his shoulder, drew a bead on the cattle baron. He could have killed him, ended it right there. But in that moment, looking down the barrel of his rifle at the man who had tried to destroy him, Caleb hesitated. Killing Stone in cold blood even now felt wrong. It wasn't justice. It was just more killing. "Stone!" Caleb roared, his voice echoing through the gorge. "It's over. Call off your men. Surrender, or none of you leave this valley alive." Stone stared up at Caleb, his face a mask of defeated fury. He knew he was beaten. His force was shattered. His pride, his power, broken in this bloody, rocky trap. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hands. "All right, Thorn," he called back, his voice hoarse. "All right, we yield." The firing sputtered, then died. A stunned, ringing silence descended over Redemption Creek Gorge, broken only by the groans of the wounded, the nervous whinnying of horses, and the distant, terrified cries of Matthew and Emily from their hiding place in the cave, cries that were quickly hushed by Sarah. Caleb, Josiah, and Smith cautiously emerged from their positions, rifles still ready. They disarmed Stone and his remaining riders, a sullen, battered group, their arrogance replaced by fear and humiliation. The battle for Redemption Valley, the bloody climax of months of harassment and intimidation, was over. Caleb Thorne, the disabled veteran, aided by his loyal friend, an old trapper, and the courage of his wife, had faced down the cattle king and won. But the victory was costly, paid for in blood, in fear, in the further erosion of innocence. The gorge, once a place of rugged beauty, was now littered with the dead and wounded, a grim testament to the price of defiance and the enduring human cost of greed. The immediate aftermath of the battle in Redemption Creek Gorge was grim and chaotic. Caleb, Josiah, and old Jedediah Smith, though victorious, were faced with the grim task of tending to the wounded, both their own, though miraculously their casualties were light, and Stone's men, many of whom were badly injured. Sarah, emerging from the cave with Matthew and Emily once the danger was past, her face pale but resolute, immediately set to work, tearing strips from her petticoats for bandages, her nursing skills, honed during the war, proving invaluable. Even young Matthew, his fear replaced by a grim sense of purpose, helped fetch water from the creek for the wounded. Jedediah Stone himself was uninjured, but his pride, his power, were shattered. He sat slumped against a rock, a broken man, watching as Caleb and Josiah efficiently disarmed his remaining riders and organized the care of the wounded. He offered no resistance, no further threats, only a sullen, defeated silence. Sheriff Henderson from Blackstone, alerted by riders who had fled the gorge early in the fight, arrived late that afternoon with a hastily assembled posse. He took one look at the carnage, at the grim, determined faces of Caleb Thorne and his allies, at the defeated cattle baron, and his usual bluster evaporated. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that Jedediah Stone's reign in this part of the territory was over. He also knew he would have to answer some very hard questions from the territorial authorities about his own inaction, in the face of Stone's blatant aggression. He meekly took Stone and his wounded men into custody, promising a full investigation, his eyes avoiding Caleb's steady, accusing gaze. The legal and political fallout was significant. Elijah Kent, the young lawyer from Blackstone, armed with Caleb's meticulous documentation of Stone's harassment and the undeniable evidence of the unprovoked attack in the gorge, pressed his case vigorously. Jedediah Stone, despite his wealth and connections, found himself facing serious charges: incitement to riot, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy. His empire began to crumble as other homesteaders, emboldened by Caleb's victory, came forward with their own stories of Stone's bullying and land grabs. The territorial governor, under pressure to restore order and perhaps seeing an opportunity to curb the power of the big cattle barons, eventually ruled in favor of Caleb and the other settlers. Stone's claims on Redemption Valley were invalidated. He was forced to pay hefty fines and reparations. Though he avoided prison time due to his age and influence, his power was broken, his reputation ruined. He retreated to his Bar M ranch, a bitter, isolated old man. Redemption Valley was finally, truly, Caleb Thorne's. He and Sarah, with Josiah's steadfast help, began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. They repaired the cabin, rebuilt the fences, replanted the garden. The O'Donnells and the Garcias, their own claims now secure, offered assistance, their earlier doubts replaced by profound gratitude and respect. The small community, forged in shared hardship and common defense, grew stronger, more united. Old Jedediah Smith, his part in the drama played, faded back into the mountains, though he occasionally left gifts of fresh game or medicinal herbs at Caleb's doorstep, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. Caleb Thorne never fully recovered from his war wounds. The ache in his shoulder, the limp in his leg, remained constant companions. But the deeper wounds, the scars on his soul, began to heal. He had faced down injustice, defended his home, protected his family. He had found redemption, not in forgetting the past, but in building a future rooted in courage, resilience, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. He had proven that even a broken man, guided by an unbroken will, could carve out a piece of peace, a patch of promise, in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the American West. His dream of Redemption Valley, once threatened by greed and violence, had endured, a testament to the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary odds. And Josiah, the loyal friend, the unexpected ally? He stayed on at Redemption Valley, becoming an indispensable part of the Thorne household, a beloved uncle to Matthew and Emily, Caleb's right hand in rebuilding the ranch. His quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, were cornerstones of their new life, a constant reminder that even in the darkest times, the bonds of comradeship, forged in shared struggle, could endure and illuminate the path forward. Their small, isolated ranch became a true sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of war were finally laid to rest, replaced by the sounds of children's laughter, the lowing of cattle, and the quiet murmur of a creek flowing freely through a valley that had truly lived up to its name. So Caleb Thorne, the disabled veteran, found his peace, not by escaping the scars of his past, but by confronting the challenges of his present, by refusing to let his wounds define him, or his dreams be extinguished by the greed of others. His story, friends, is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that true strength isn't always measured in physical prowess or the absence of scars, but in the courage to stand for what's right, even when you're outnumbered, even when you're hurting, even when the world tells you you're broken. It speaks to us about the nature of courage itself. Caleb's courage wasn't the flashy bravado of a gunslinger, but the quiet, stubborn, day-by-day courage of a man determined to build a life, protect his family, and hold on to his dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the courage of endurance, the courage of conviction, the courage to say no more to injustice, even when every instinct might scream for retreat. And what of alliances? The loyalty of Josiah, the gruff wisdom of old Jed Smith, the eventual solidarity of the other settlers. These remind us that no one truly stands alone, especially on the frontier. Help often comes from unexpected quarters, and the bonds forged in shared struggle, in common defense of what is right and good, are often the strongest, most enduring connections we can make. Caleb's fight became their fight, and in that unity, they found a strength that none possessed individually. This tale also cautions us about the insidious nature of power and greed, personified by Jedediah Stone. His belief in his own entitlement, his contempt for the rights of others, his willingness to use violence and intimidation to achieve his ends. These are timeless warnings. But his ultimate defeat, at the hands of those he sought to crush, reminds us that such power, built on injustice, is ultimately fragile, vulnerable to the combined force of courage, truth, and community resolve. Caleb Thorne's Redemption Valley was more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol of hope, of perseverance, of the enduring human need to create something meaningful, something lasting, even in the most unforgiving environments. His scars, both visible and invisible, were not badges of weakness, but testaments to his survival, his strength, his refusal to be defined by his wounds. He teaches us that healing doesn't always mean erasing the past, but integrating it, learning from it, and using its lessons to build a stronger, more compassionate future. Out here, in the vast, often harsh landscapes of the American West, stories like Caleb Thorne's are etched into the very soil. They are tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, finding courage they didn't know they possessed, forging communities in the face of isolation, and carving out lives of dignity and purpose against all odds. They remind us that the true pioneering spirit isn't just about claiming land, it's about claiming one's own resilience, one's own humanity. If this story of Caleb Thorne, his family, and their fight for Redemption Valley has resonated with you, if it has stirred something in your own heart about the nature of courage, the importance of standing for justice, or the enduring power of the human spirit, I invite you to share it. Let these voices from our past continue to inspire, to teach, to remind us of the best of who we can be. We'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does resilience mean to you? How have you seen courage blossom in unexpected places? And as always, if you wish to continue exploring these rich, resonant tales from our shared American heritage, these voices of justice that speak of hardship overcome and hope rekindled, please do subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told, many more lessons to be learned around this campfire. Until next time, friends, may you find strength in your own scars. May you have the courage to defend your own Redemption Valley, whatever form it takes, and may you always remember that even a broken body can house an unbreakable spirit. This is your narrator, wishing you peace, resilience, and the unwavering courage of your convictions. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.